Much of the urinary system is just tubes and sacs and funnels, but of course their names are more complicated than that. So we start by studying urinary anatomy and starting to get specific with the names and features of a lot of structures which you've already heard of. The function of the urinary system is to remove nitrogenous waste created by cellular metabolism from the body. What I mean is that some things that you eat, for example, like carbs, well, they have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. But other things like proteins and nucleic acids have a lot of nitrogen. And that's one thing your body's not very good at reusing. You need to get it out of the body. And metabolism occurs when cells are building stuff or breaking stuff down. So, breaking down the foods you eat, for example, can release this nitrogen. And the kidneys are the primary urinary organs because they are the ones that will filter the blood to get rid of those nitrogenous wastes, along with other stuff. The urinary system also has several homeostatic effects. Like, as a very basic example, there's this chemical in your body, very dangerous in high amounts, water. If you have too much water, that's a homeostatic imbalance. You can pee out a little extra water. Now, of course, that's a very basic example, but it is similar to some of the things we'll talk about this time or you'll learn about in physiology. And there are other effects that the urinary system has, like the hormone erythropoietin is created by the kidneys. The kidneys play a role in activating vitamin D, lots of other stuff that is outside of this course. So let's make sure first we understand what is pee. It's a lot of water, of course, and there's other stuff mixed in. But the big thing in the urine we'll talk about are these metabolic wastes. And keep in mind, this is mostly unrelated to the digestive system because, well, what is poop? Poop is the undigestible matter, mostly from plants, fiber and stuff, that can't be digested, and then it's mixed with water and a bunch of dead bacteria. Here we're talking about water, but then all of these metabolic wastes. Now, if you eat too much sugar, then yeah, you can pee the extra sugar out. So the urinary system and digestive system are somewhat related, but they're kind of more or less doing their own thing. The metabolic wastes that humans make a lot of are urea, especially. That's our primary byproduct of breaking down proteins in our body. And what these nitrogenous wastes make is ammonia, but that's very toxic. We can't have ammonia in our body, so we use a little bit of energy, a little ATP, and we convert it by using carbon dioxide and water into urea, which is non-toxic. We also make this other byproduct called uric acid. That's actually takes more energy to make, so there's not a lot of good reasons to do so. Although birds make a lot of uric acid. It's what makes their urine so pasty. And the reason they do that is so that they can fly. Uric acid is much more concentrated and it makes it lighter so they don't have to carry around a giant bladder full of water. And by the way, why is bird poop white, we ask here? Well, remember, birds aren't so different from us. They consume food, and then there's some stuff they can't digest, which is feces. And then they make metabolic waste products, nitrogen, and they get rid of those through uric acid. So, in fact, next time you look at a bird poop, look closely. There should be some white, pasty stuff. That's the uric acid. That's bird pee. Then look for some darker chunks of black or brownish gunk, and that's bird poop. The big difference is they come out of the same time because birds just have one hole, a cloaca, that everything mixes in. Moving on, there's other wastes like urochrome is another urinary waste, but these are the big players, especially urea. Okay, so now let's start to name parts of the urinary anatomy, starting with kidneys, bean-shaped, reddish-brown. You've got two of them. They're retroperitoneal, so they're behind that serous membrane. that helps provide a friction-free environment for your stomach and intestines. And they're in your superior lumbar region. The right kidney is a little lower than the left because the liver takes up so much space in the right side of your upper abdominal pelvic quadrant. And they have three coverings to protect them. Although the first one, the capsule, is kind of just a capsule, just some connective tissue to keep the organ together. But around that is an adipose capsule, so a fat layer to help protect it. And there's renal fascia, some more connective tissue to further protect the kidneys. And if you don't eat kidney beans, yeah, they look just like kidneys. So here's a look at our kidneys, partially protected by the ribs, but not very much. So they have those other capsules to protect them. And if you were to look in a cadaver and you open up the abdominal pelvic quadrant, you would have to remove the stomach and the intestines. And when you did all that, you would hit the back of the peritoneal cavity. So then you'd have to cut through that. And then there'd be a bunch of fascia you'd have to cut through. And then there'd be a bunch of fat to cut through. And only then could you expose the kidneys to look like this. So they're very deep, deep, deep in the abdominal pelvic quadrant. Okay, let's do a little drawing here. Let's start with a very little drawing. Here's just a small kidney. And I want you to remember that, like a lot of organs, the outer part of this organ we'll call the cortex, and this whole inner part we'll call the medulla. So I'm using a numbered system in this drawing. Number 1 is the cortex, and number 2 is the medulla. Then you can get into a little more detail here and draw renal pyramids. So the medulla has a bunch of these pyramid-shaped structures. They look like triangles, right? But in 3 dimensions, they're shaped like pyramids, the renal pyramids. So let's put a number 3 on one of our pyramids. And at the tip of each pyramid is a little papilla. And we've seen lots of papilla in the body. It always means nipple-shaped. I don't know why this jumped over here, but we'll put a number 4 for a papilla. In between the pyramids are renal columns. And as we'll learn quickly, blood will come into the kidney, make their way through all these pyramids and columns and such, and get to the cortex, where the blood will be filtered, and then the blood will exit more or less the way it came. But the urine, or what will become urine, will drip down through the renal pyramids into the renal papilla, and then drip down and get caught in a little cup. Here's a little cup. Here's a little cup. Here's a little cup. Let's just draw a few of them. And each of these little cups is called a minor calyx. 6. So singular would be calyx, C-A-L-Y-X. So each of these minor calyces catch some urine dripping from the renal papilla, and then when they merge, they form number 7, which is a major calyx. And then all of these will eventually merge into this big funnel called the renal pelvis, which just gets skinny into a tube, and that's the ureter. So we'll see these structures again and again, but just to kind of walk you through them a little bit more slowly, some of these terms are just geographical, and some of these terms are more functional. And this is a great kind of 3-dimensional rendition of a kidney, where you can see the minor calyces and how as they merge, they form what are called major calyces. And when they've all merged, you formed a renal pelvis. And then really we just change its name when it becomes more tube-shaped and we call it the ureter. But these little funnels, these calyces, you can see better here that some are going to face up, some are going to face, out, some will face away from us or towards us. This is a three-dimensional structure. Now let's revisit that blood flow I mentioned. We'll just talk about this in simple terms first. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So we're in the systemic circuit. We're going to filter this blood. A lot of the blood in the systemic circuit goes to the kidneys, something like 25% or more. So it comes in through the renal artery, and then this artery will branch and go in between the pyramids, and it will go up and into the cortex. And then the blood will be filtered, and the blood will come down over the pyramids, down through the columns, and eventually connect back into the renal vein. And now it's all clean, and off it goes. Then the urine will drain from the pelvis into the ureter. Great. We just have to name all of those blood vessels that branch through the kidneys. So here's kind of a cheat sheet down in the corner for this, but we can again start with the renal artery. And as soon as it starts to branch, the renal artery will branch to different segments of the kidney. So those branches are called segmental arteries. Then they're going to go in between the renal pyramids. And really, the kidney is a bunch of little lobes. You know what I mean? It's not like the heart where each feature is kind of unique. Each valve does a certain job. Here it's like a bunch of repeating subunits called lobes. So when the blood vessel splits again, and let me show you with this. When this vessel, which is a segmental artery, splits again and goes in between the renal pyramids, which are little lobes of the kidney, it's called an interlobar artery. That makes sense? And after they go in between the lobes, look at these arteries as they arc over the top of the renal pyramids. Because they arc like that, they're called arcuate arteries. Pretty good. And the last thing they do is they radiate into the cortex. They're like a ray of sunshine, a straight piece of vessel going into the cortex. So those are called cortical radiate arteries. And you can see that in this list of blood vessels, this box is indicating stuff that's so small we can't really see it on this image. So we're going to come back to this later on. When we're actually ready to filter the blood, we will see all of these blood vessels. But after the filtration process is complete, the blood is going to return more or less the way it came, down through cortical radiate veins into the arcuate veins, and then through the interlobar veins, and then, depending on who you ask, into segmental veins, and then the renal vein. If you ask the International Federation of Associations of Anatomists, which is this oversight agency that releases these master guides to anatomy, for some reason, they didn't include segmental veins in their most recent publication, which I think is pretty old. So most textbooks don't label them, but you can see the segmental veins there. Perfect mirror images of the segmental arteries. You can Google it if you want. I did. It's not that exciting of an argument. Okay, now as we do some basic anatomy, I don't want to get too tiny because we'll come back to the actual filtration process later. But if we look really closely up here in the cortex, we can see these things called nephrons. So those are the functional units of the kidney. This is where filtration happens. You've got about 1 million of them in each of your kidneys, and each nephron has two parts. A renal corpuscle, shown here and here, that means a little body, right? A corpse is a body. A corpuscle is a little small body. And everything else here is a tubule. So a little body and a little tube. Here's another view of a nephron, again with a corpuscle and everything else is a tubule. We should mention though there are two types. Cortical nephrons hang out in the cortex. Juxtamedullary nephrons extend deep in the medulla. And there are, of course, reasons for that. But we're just sticking with the anatomy, so let's move on. Filtration's done. The blood is clean. The urine is made. What are we going to do with it? We send it into the ureter, which has 3 layers of tissue. There's a mucosal layer inside made of transitional epithelium. There's a muscularis layer and adventitia, connective tissue sheath around the outside. Because there's muscle in the ureters, you won't be surprised to know that it's going to use that muscle to push urine down the ureters through peristalsis, that worm-like motion to kind of milk the urine down the ureter. And eventually the ureters will plug into the back of the bladder. The bladder will store the urine, of course, and its wall has 3 layers. Mucosa made of transitional epithelium, just like the ureter. There's a muscular layer, just like the ureter, and an outer adventitia, just like the ureter. But the big difference is in this muscular layer. The bladder has this thick muscular layer called the detrusor muscle, and that's what will push the urine out of the bladder during urination. We should also note, in order to expand, the bladder has rugae, just like the stomach had rugae. Those wrinkles or folds that are kind of like this when the bladder is empty, and as it starts to fill, things get smoother and the rugae go away. Note also this triangular shape here that's called the trigone, because we'll talk about that here, that the trigone has stretch receptors. And so at about 8 ounces of urine, those stretch receptors will send a signal to the brain that the bladder can be emptied. And if you're an infant, a 1-year-old, maybe a 2-year-old, maybe even older, a reflex action will occur and the bladder will just start to push and the sphincters will relax and urination will happen. But once you're potty trained, you can override that signal and basically wait to urinate until you're in a socially appropriate context. And so we can wait until we are ready, and at which point, you might need to take a minute and relax, but you can't consciously contract the detrusor muscle. You can't consciously relax the internal urinary sphincter found down at the neck of the bladder. Those are involuntary muscles. Really, the only thing you can control is the external urinary sphincter, right? So if you're doing the pee-pee dance, that means your body has finally decided the muscles it's in charge of are going to do their thing. The bladder will contract, the internal urinary sphincter will relax. So all you can do is lock down and hold tight until you make it to the bathroom or your muscle is exhausted. Finally, we've reached the urethra. This is just a tube that will carry the urine from the bladder to the outside world, or more specifically to the urethral orifice. There's a mucosa lining of transitional epithelium at the superior end of this tube, but by the time you get to the urethral orifice, you really got to have stratified squamous epithelium, because that's the classic tissue that we find lining a lot of our mucous membranes to help keep out bacteria and viruses and debris and things like that. We can see here that there are some differences between the male and female urethra, so let's just look a little bit more closely at those and then we'll be done. The male urethra actually has three regions: prostatic, membranous, and spongy urethra. And we will revisit these when we do the reproductive system because the male urethra is used for both urination and reproduction. But briefly, if we look at the bladder here, we can find the trigone, the internal urinary sphincter at the neck of the bladder, and then right here is that big prostate gland. So the portion of the urethra that goes through the prostate is the prostatic urethra. Then there's this band of muscle called the urogenital diaphragm. Think of it as a membrane because the next part of the urethra is called the membranous urethra. And it's going through this little bit of muscle. And then you're in the penis, so you can call it the penile urethra or the spongy urethra. And we'll talk about why you would call it the spongy urethra when we talk about reproduction. This urethra is about 20 centimeters in length, very different than the female urethra, no separate regions, and only about 4 centimeters in length, which means it's a short journey to reach the bladder for some bacteria that can cause UTIs. And on that note, we will come back for a little interlude, just a short taste of the basics of filtration of blood in the kidneys. And then in part 3, we'll get into the deets.